Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session of the NEMA Learning Lab series. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Marko Bourne of ICF to begin today's event. Marko, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate it. And I'm Marko Bourne. I'm Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at ICF. And we're pleased to be able to share insights and develop this virtual learning lab with NEMA with such a fantastic lineup of presenters. Everyone on the panel today are living and breathing the issues we all as emergency managers, public health officials, housing officials, private sector partners face every single day. And today's session is going to be a little bit different from perhaps your normal webinar or normal interactive session. And that is, rather than the traditional panel presentations and then a structured Q&A, this is going to be interactive with you, the participants. We have two panels today. In between the two panels, there will be a brief break. There will be interactive sessions within each of the panels, and the panelists are going to be able to interact with what's being placed on the board and interact obviously with each other as we go forward. I'd like to take a minute or two to certainly introduce our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to our moderator. First panelist, one of the panelists we have here in the first group is Alex Amparo. He is the senior official performing the duties of the Deputy Administrator of FEMA Resilience. Many of you know Alex from his role as the Assistant Administrator of FEMA's National Preparedness Directorate, his role as Assistant Administrator for the Recovery Directorate, and his time serving as the Disaster Federal Recovery Coordinator in Puerto Rico from 2019 to 2020. Alex has a long history with FEMA and has been engaged in many disasters over the years, a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and lives in Virginia now. And Alex for joining us. We also have Executive Director Manuel Laboy Rivera. He is the Executive Director of the Central Office of Recovery, Reconstruction, and Resilience in Puerto Rico. Long experience of more than 20 years in industries to include manufacturing, chemical production, living sciences, and has also a bachelor's and a master's degree. And prior to taking over the role of the Core 3 Executive Director, he was Secretary of the Department of Economic Development and Commerce in Puerto Rico. And we are pleased also to have you as well, sir. Our final panelist on the first group is Jessie H. Kome, who's currently the Director of the Office of Block Grant Assistance at HUD. She was the Deputy Director from 2009 to 2019 and directs a team that's setting policy for close to $3.4 billion in annual community development block grants, and including the Section 108 loan guarantees. She's responsible for more than 30 years at HUD as a program innovator, policy designer, national community development advocate, and an advocate for transparent information technology programs. And we thank Jessie for joining our panels as well today. I'm going to introduce our second panel too now, but we'll certainly reemphasize that when we start it. We're joined on the second group by Karl Bruchhaus, who's the Chief Financial Officer for the Calcasieu Parish School Board in Louisiana. 18 years now and superintendent for the last 6.5 years, is a certified public accountant and graduated from McNeese State University in 1987 with an accounting degree. He's an active member of many professional organizations and active in his community and with his family. And Karl, thank you so much also for being with us. He's also joined on that second group by Dan Kaniewski. Dan is, of course, Managing Director of Public Sector at Marsh & McLennan Companies, which brings risk strategy to 75,000 experts that they have at Marsh & McLennan and its sister companies, Guy Carpenter, Mercer, and Oliver Wyman, serving clients in over 130 countries. But most of you know Dan as the former head and deputy administrator for resilience at FEMA. He's also currently a member of the Department of Homeland Security Advisory and has had many roles in several administrations over the last 20 years with a PhD in from Georgetown University. And finally, we're also joined on this panel by somebody who's lived this at both the federal, state, and local level, and now in the private sector as well, Jeff Byard. Jeff is a former Marine Corps veteran, in gray shirt, serves now as the Vice President of Operations for Team Rubicon. He leads a highly functional and diverse team of staff and volunteers that are growing and delivering staff and volunteers for disaster relief across the country. And he was the former Associate Administrator of the Office of Response and Recovery at FEMA and the Executive Operations Officer at the Alabama Emergency Management Agency. And so thank you, Jeff, also for joining us. Our panelists join us along with a number of folks from around the country who have been experts in this role for many, many years. And ICF is pleased to be part of this. For 30 years, we've supported federal, state, and local efforts, and we're honored to have these panelists with us today. Our moderator, who I'll introduce now, is Mike Whitaker. We affectionately call him Whit. It's the only name he actually knows to go by anymore these days. He's Senior Vice President for Client Services and Innovation at ICF, and he's going to take you all through today's specific format on how we're going to operate, guide you on how you can be part of the solutioning. So Whit, please take it away, and thank you.
Thanks, Marco. Yeah, we have about 12, 13 minutes per panelist as we go through the discussion. Each panelist will open up with a few minutes of remarks, and then we will go into question and answer discussion. So without further ado, I think we'll go over to Alex and kick off the panel discussions.
Great, thanks, Whit, and thank you all for this opportunity. Really grateful to be here this afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you, and it's great to see. I guess I would say a lot of names familiar on the screen as well. It's amazing that we all have adapted to this technology, and talking about adaptation is where I'd like to kind of take this discussion for us today. And since the Biden-Harris administration transitioned in the 20th of January, there have been about 50 executive actions that have focused around immediate areas of priorities that deal with either COVID-19, the economy, equity, climate change, healthcare, immigration, and restoring America's standing. For FEMA, those executive actions that are relevant to us are really bucketed in 4 different categories. Definitely the COVID-19 that has folks here focused in the vaccination of Americans throughout the country and supporting that in states and locality as well. The economy, equity, and climate change. And zoomed in onto the mural board, you're seeing the 5 executive actions that really relate directly to the work that we're doing. And I'll just give you a brief kind of synopsis. The first being the 13985, which really focuses on looking at and recognizing that the climate is in crisis, and that it also has exposed some inequities among underserved communities. The next executive action, 14008, and you don't all have to memorize these. This again will be up and saved as part of the YouTube video moving forward, is that again, climate in crisis, and there should be national policy that focuses also on climate as a national security threat. And so there should be national security planning around this. This also is forces a kind of government-wide approach towards tackling the climate through a variety of different areas. The third is the memorandum of restoring trust in government through scientific integrity. And that again focuses on champion evidence-based guide with the best available data. The next one, 13990, for the most part looks at prioritizing environmental justice. And we'll talk a little bit about what environmental justice means in the context of climate change and in the context of us as emergency managers or public health officials. And then finally, the EO 14007 establishes the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology to advise in policymaking and the like. So again, those were the executive orders since the transition that we felt directly related to us here at FEMA. And we have been doing thinking internally, though we do anticipate soon having our political leadership on board, starting with our administrator. We know that there's some work for us to do. And so we have been meeting internally as a leadership team, knowing that we want to look at different courses of actions, different opportunities that we can then present to fulfill the intent of these actions. And so what I'd like to be able to do is to bring you in to that discussion as part of being participating in this workshop. I mean, these are the real questions that we've been asking ourselves in defining terms, and just to be able to level set us. When we talk about climate change, when we look at, and if we could scroll down to the definitions, when we look at just empirical, scroll up, excuse me. When you look at empirical data that exists through NOAA, the climate is changing. And we know that through increased temperatures of the ocean or global land temperatures, the rise of sea level, the loss of ice on the Earth's poles, the mountain glaciers, the frequency and severity and changes in extreme weather, hurricanes, heat waves, droughts, floods, precipitation, those are all documented in empirical data. And so climate change is that long-term weather pattern change that we're seeing. Adaptation is taking into account that future change in things that we're doing right now. So knowing that if there is a sea level rise, looking at higher construction. When we look at environmental justice, it's a recognition. And for me in working disasters, it's what we see out in the field, that these events that occur, whether it's a hurricane or a tornado, have the opportunity and often do disproportionately impact low-income communities. And those folks have a greater difficulty at achieving a sustainable recovery over time. So environmental justice is taking that into account and looking at how do we run our programs, and are there opportunities for equity that would allow those hard to hit, underserved communities to be able to better recover. I would couch all of those things under resilience. And that for us right now, and for me leading this team here in resilience, is how do we make our nation stronger? Because we know that there will be a response and recovery. But if we start from a position of strength, then that response and recovery would be most successful. The question is why are we talking about this now? And if you look at disaster cost over time,
Alex, just for the time consideration, to make sure we have time for the discussion, do you want to jump to the questions at the bottom? I mean, I think the disaster cost rising over time is critical, but I want to make sure we have a chance to engage the audience on these questions around how we define success in the
absolutely, Whit. Let me just say that this is 40 years adjusted for inflation, and that's undeniable. These are $1 billion or more storms. And so what you're seeing is in 2020, we had 22 of those, right? Compared to 1980 when there were 3. And the trend there is undeniable. And that's why we have to have that's why we have to have a change. At the end of the day, and I'll conclude my remarks, opening remarks, and then we can go into questions. The reality is that over time, the climate has changed faster than we have. And that's a trend that we need to flip. And so I'll leave it with that, Whit, and then go to the focus questions that we're asking ourselves internally. And these were across all senior executives is what success looks like. You know, what are we doing in this space already that can be augmented? Where are there opportunities for progress? And where are there quick wins as well? And that's a question that we ask ourselves, but I would say that these are questions that everyone on this Zoom should be asking themselves as well. You'll have brick information that we'll leave with you that you can review at your leisure, but that will be one of the ways that we will look at furthering the intent within this administration with the information that we receive.
On your what is success and what are we trying to achieve in terms of climate change, I'm curious how you're looking at that kind of across these connections that you mentioned in your opening remarks. So the connection between climate change and environmental justice, the connection between climate change and equity, the connection between climate change and national security. That's a different lens than just a limit on emissions or limiting to a certain degree temperature rise. So how are you looking at that, or do you have cases where you think it's been done well as examples?
I mean, I think that this is a real growth opportunity when you look across the nation and you realize that only 38% of jurisdictions have adopted either the 2015 or the 2018 consensus building codes. That means that there are 62% that haven't. Just in the adoption of building codes, latest codes that account for current conditions, we would move the needle. And so how do we incentivize that? I quite frankly think that we will do more, at least as an agency, by influencing others to do something than we could within our billions of dollars in grant programs.
Okay. So the building codes are a good example. Is there something that you're seeing as kind of a common equity is one that it's a little trickier to measure than a physical building quality or environmental justice? Are there metrics that you're starting to see, or ways that you feel like you can, as an agency, can influence those intersections?
Yeah, I mean, we can look at our national flood insurance program and, the cost of flood insurance, whether you are in a low-income house or a high-income house, and are they comparable there? Is it proportional? There's empirical data already on community recovery post-disaster, and those that you look at a 5-year span or a 10-year span since a disaster happened. What's the net worth of the individual? Has it increased or has it decreased? And in low-income communities, we see that in that 10 years, it decreases, while in more affluent communities, it can increase up to 100%. So they're in where we're at right now is looking then at our programs, individual assistance, flood insurance, that go directly to helping people, as well as investment, and looking at these communities and saying, how can we, is there an opportunity for us to prioritize investments in communities of greatest need, or add and focus in those areas if we know that they're disproportionately impacted. So those are the things that we're looking at internally, but we're certainly also looking to more ideas of where we can influence others to join us in this space.
Thanks, Alex. About 1 minute plus here. A couple questions came in, and see if you have some quick thoughts. Is FEMA looking to expand eligible mitigation projects for local jurisdictions that would address climate change and lower carbon impact? Or working with mitigation projects, has FEMA looked at the long-term effects of stormwater management further downstream from areas of suburban construction? So 2 questions, and do you have any quick thoughts on those before we move on to Manuel?
Yes, and yes. The answers, and not only are we looking to expand the area, we're also looking at what are the ways that we can incentivize and find more of those types of projects that provide the greatest amount of benefit.
That's great. Alex, appreciate that. And we'll see if we have some time for broader discussion after these other panelists. But Manuel, I want to give you an opportunity to come in with your opening remarks, and we'll continue the discussion and look for connections across these presentations as well.
So thank you.
There we go.
Honored part of this and this event. In the introduction, my name is Manuel Laboy. I am the current executive director for the Centralized Office of Recovery, Reconstruction, and Resiliency for the government of Puerto Rico. And I'm also the governor's authorized representative. I've been in this job for 2 months, for a fact. And prior to this assignment, I was the secretary for economic development and commerce for the governor of 4 years. So very, very happy to be part of this. I'm going to share a couple of slides. I believe that you guys are going to show the presentation, correct? Yes. So I think that there's a lot of news and what has been communicated about Puerto Rico since 2017 for us reasons. We were hit by in 2017, which basically devastated island down to roads and bridges, the electrical grid, the water utility system, and also the housing infrastructure, among others. And we are actively right now managing this disaster. And after some challenging years to work, hand by hand with FEMA and, the municipalities and the government in itself and the nonprofits, we are moving now at full speed for full recovery when it comes down to the permanent reconstruction, the permanent work that is going to allow to modernize the infrastructure of Puerto Rico in the years to come. By the same token, as you know, we were hit by the earthquakes in 2020, early 2020. It impacted 14 municipalities. In the case of Maria, the full island, 78 municipalities was heavily impacted. In the case of the earthquakes, 14 municipalities right now are actively in the process of assessing the damages, finalizing inspections, and working towards, working with the scope of work and the cost estimates associated with what will take to recover from this disaster. So we're managing these disasters actively. And of course, since March of 2020, we also being impacted heavily by the pandemic of COVID-19, with all the repercussions that comes with that in terms of affecting public health and the economy. So Puerto Rico, it's quite an interesting, business case or showcase in this case, when it comes down to managing multiple disasters at the same time, I will say, and with different characteristics, different manifestations, and profiles when it comes down to the disaster and its impact to the island, and how, moving forward with recovery will intertwine in terms of the desired outcomes in terms of reconstruction and moving forward with the recovery. So being in the job for 2 months, like I said, prior to this assignment, my predecessor worked very, very close with FEMA to achieve a number of priorities that we believe are, were crucial, were, fundamental to put Puerto Rico in the path for sustainable recovery. And I will say that close relationship with FEMA yielded results such as accelerating the formulation of the different projects for permanent work, specifically the electric utility system, the water and the aqueduct system in Puerto Rico, and the infrastructure for the education of the island. Only with those three approaches for those three areas or sectors, we have right now close to $15 billion obligated for permanent work. So there's been a lot of effort, a lot of work to get there, and now is the time to move to execution. So, with that in mind, I'm just, reflecting here, what are our top, 8 priorities moving forward in 2021 at the stage where we are with the disaster recovery for Maria, the hurricanes, and these will also be integrated in terms of the earthquakes recovery and the pandemic recovery. So number one, we are moving ahead with accelerating disbursements of obligated projects in addition to emergency, but now focused on the permanent work and the actual reconstruction. And that involves different tactics and different strategies associated with ensuring that our subrecipients have the capital, the cash flow to actually move ahead with the execution of the projects, so we can also expedite managing, the request for reimbursement for all these subrecipients. Also goes hand, by to manage the non-fair requirements associated of our the Maria disaster, the 10% non-federal share is coming from CDBG-DR. So it's one of our top priorities because we want to make sure that is a critical mass when it comes down to the actual financing of projects that we can move forward with this implementation and addressing the gaps. Number two is advancing the proposal of the application packages to ensure that we can really have the projects for hazard mitigation under Section 404. Right now, we are at full stage that we can $4 million worth of projects under 404. 75% of that it's from FEMA 404, and 25% is coming for a global match from CDBG MIT. So it is a top priority, and we need to meet a deadline by October of this year that we will submit all the proposals to FEMA for its subsequent evaluation and hopefully the obligation of these projects. Number three,
Manuel, I want to make sure I want to make sure we keep about 5 minutes for the audience questions. So if there's, within the last 60 seconds here, if there's a couple highlights you want to hit here, but I want to make sure we have a chance for you to respond during the slot.
No problem. Got it. So we are accelerating, execution of projects. We're actively with the recipients. We have a number of deadlines and strengthening organization to ensure that we can really push forward the acceleration of the recovery. Finally, there are two specific, legal frameworks at Puerto Rico level, at the state level, which is my final slide, that are related to resiliency. Number one is that we have an act, the Puerto Rico Energy Public Act of 2019, has aggressive goals associated with renewable energy. So by 2050, the whole island, the entire island, has to be powered by renewable energy. And also we have a legal and regulatory framework to promote climate change projects to achieve, very aggressive goals when it comes down to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing also energy consumption, also addressing the solid waste management issues of Puerto Rico, and also reforestation of the island. So I believe that the programs of assistance program from FEMA for reconstruction, CDDR, CDGMI, and hazard mitigation 4 all together with this framework at the state level, we believe that we can really put Puerto Rico in the path for addressing true resiliency in the years to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Manuel. Again, I encourage folks to add comments or questions to the chat. I am curious, it's helpful to see the Climate Change Act for Puerto Rico, and Alex talked about the executive orders at the administration level around climate change and environmental justice and equity and some of those intersections. And I noticed on your second slide, you have the KPI metric data forecasts. Have there been any discussions around what metrics or ways that you might track within your recovery some of the projects and work and how they may be impacting equity or environmental justice or these things that happen at the intersection of climate change and some of the other social metrics?
That's a very good question. And to be honest, I think when it comes down to things related to renewable energy is more easy to track and more easy to quantify, especially because a lot of the projects that we have under PA and 404 are directly related to achieve those goals. But when it comes down to climate change, it's a little more challenging, I will say. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to work directly with the panel experts. The climate change law in Puerto Rico basically assembled a panel of experts. And these experts right now are putting together a strategic plan. And the whole idea is that we can integrate everything associated with recovery and reconstruction, especially on a project basis and an outcome basis, and work with this panel of experts to ensure that we can achieve that. But right now, actually, is an opportunity, but we don't have the basis right now to do that, and we're trying to work with that, with the panel of experts.
That's very helpful context there. I haven't seen anything else come up in the chat. Oh, here we go. what would you recommend other states and communities do to be ready for addressing these kinds of issues? Let's tackle this question in a minute or so, and then we'll get to our last panelist, and we may have some time for some cross-panel discussion before the break. So the question is, what would you recommend other states and communities do to be ready for addressing these kinds of issues in the future?
Well, I would say that in the case of Puerto Rico, I mean, it was hard to imagine that we were going to be handling multiple disasters at this level. I think that the one getaway or lessons learned for other, jurisdictions, states, or even at local level is that, we're living at times that, the impossible is possible. We've got to be prepared to really manage multiple disasters at the same time, and all at different complexity levels, different profiles and different manifestations of those disasters, right? I give an example. We were at full steam, trying to expedite, assessing damages of the earthquakes, and all of a sudden, we had the pandemic, right, of COVID-19. The same earthquake basically impacted many facilities and assets that are now, or they were supposed to start recovery under Maria, right? So there's an interconnection of how these disasters, impact not only the island in terms of social and the economy, but the strategy for recovery in itself. So the number one lesson is be prepared to manage multiple disasters, and in highly complex disasters at the same time. It comes down with with the manpower, the resources, the lessons learned, from some of these experiences, and have the capability to actually address these multiple disasters at the same time. Number one. Number two, I will add that also it comes down to your specific characteristics of your jurisdiction, right? It's very different if this happens in Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Alaska, or Hawaii, because it has geographical disadvantages, versus, if you are in a state that has other contiguous states that can support each other. So understanding, those specific of your jurisdiction in terms of how that will delay, emergency management and eventually recovery will also be a plus. So altogether, that will be my two getaways.
Great, thanks, Manuel. I'd like to move on to Jessie as last panelist. I know that there's another question here that we may be able to answer in the follow-up, or if we have some slack time. But Jessie, why don't you go ahead and give your opening remarks?
Thank you. That's a tough act to follow. So I didn't mention in my bio that I've worked on long-term disaster recovery since Loma Prieta and the Northridge earthquake. I've worked 9/11, Katrina, from the HUD side, long-term recovery, Sandy, and the events of 2017, 18, and 19. One of the divisions in my office is currently the disaster recovery division, has been since 2005 or 6. So, and I was a disaster recovery division director at one point, but that's not really what I want to talk to you about today. HUD has a lot of programs: public housing, fair housing, FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, and community development programs. And I work on a community development program, CDBG, that requires a focus on low and moderate income vulnerable populations in planning and action, and it's baked into our statutory purpose. And it has a national reach to 1,200 plus, I think it's 1,264 this year, cities, counties, and states every year. It's at 3.4 billion this year, distributed by formula. And every 3 to 5 years, every one of those grantees has to do a consolidated plan, process, and a document as their application that sets their priorities for their community development block grant, their home investment partnership, which is a $1 billion plus affordable housing construction program, their homeless programs, which is another couple $2 billion worth of programs for homeless and special needs populations, and for the housing and opportunities with persons with AIDS, HOPWA program. And in that priority setting exercise, since 2016, actually starting with plans that were submitted in 2018 and forward, they have to go through, there's a resilience component, a specifically climate change resilience component, an element where they have to go consult with their emergency managers. And we've been learning that sometimes this is the very first time the community development department goes and has a talk with the emergency managers to see what they both know about vulnerable populations and what their resilience needs and disaster recovery needs might be. And they're also supposed to go talk to the populations that are potentially vulnerable and find out what their resilience needs might be, and then write that up and put it out for citizen comment. And we have only seen the first few of these come in, and we haven't put out a lot of guidance on this yet, but we are working on beginning to amplify that element and focus on it to get reach. And one of the first items I put in the chat is the community resilience toolkit that we put out, so that, and that can be used by grantees and by citizens, you know, based on the, what kind of stress or risk, you know, event risk they may have to go, or the hazard. They can go look at some possible actions they can take, begin discussions, and grantees that have used it have liked it. We're going to build on that with technical assistance to all of these communities. The reach of CDBG, the annual program, exceeds the 1,260 direct grantees, because the states and urban counties are frequently served as pass-throughs to smaller local governments. So we reach about 7,500 governments of one kind, jurisdictions a year. And if we can get them to consider resilience as part, and, you know, educate them about resilience, not only in the grant programs, but about community development practice in general, you know, including things they may fund year in and year out on with their own funding, like culverts and things like that, and other improvements, both looking at physical, social, economic, and environmental resilience, because CDBG touches on all of those. We're going to be working on that. Other parts of HUD are considering resilience actions over the next months as well. There's quite a lot of discussion in the department about this. Some of the ideas that we're considering are looking for barriers to resilience by hosting listening sessions with targeted outreach groups to try to collect people's lived experience. That's one of the reasons that I was really interested in coming here today. And possibly allying with an NGO. We did this during, in 2014 to 16, I guess, running the National Disaster Resilience Competition. That happened in my office as well. And where we put up $1 billion in CDBG disaster recovery money, and used the competition paired with the Rockefeller Foundation to try to advance practice in recovery and resilience at the same time. And then obviously right now, the Disaster Recovery and Special Issues Division, it's already been referenced, CDBG DR and CDBG MIT for mitigation are very large appropriations for, you know, double-digit billion appropriations, a huge chunk of which are going into Puerto Rico, Texas, Louisiana, and other places that have had multiple disasters. And we're watching and working with grantees there to see what they do, what works, and we're going to be trying to mine out and share lessons learned and do peer-to-peer. So that was all I had for my prepared remarks. I don't know if you have any comments or anything, but I'd be happy to do any Q&As.
So I know we have a couple of questions that are in the mural board that we could certainly delve into further. You know, one personal note, I grew up a mile from the Northridge earthquake epicenter, so
yeah,
struck a chord with me there when you started to talk about that.
Officer for the community development programs for the West Coast when that happened.
Yeah.
I worked on Rodney King riots too.
Yeah.
11.
So one of the questions that came in was talking about some of the lessons learned, and I know you talked about a lot of topics in your lead in, and certainly
Yeah.
got a little bit to where Alex was talking about, and using some of the programs from the agency in order to almost compel is probably too strong of a word, but at least provide an environment for pushing forward action. You talked a lot about how you created new conversations that perhaps weren't there through guidance and what had to be in the plan, and some of the groups that needed to be engaged. And you talked about potentially going out with an NGO and having some of these targeted outreach and listening sessions. So I'd be curious what you've learned, building off this question, what you've learned so far, and kind of what you're maybe setting as your key objectives, or even some key results that would show progress.
We haven't set, HUD has not set goals yet. We're definitely in the how can we build on what we have phase of discussions then for us, new administration is still coming aboard. But what I've learned is that frequently the local jurisdictions in the states know a heck of a lot more than I do about what can be done, and that what, as a funder, we have to learn how to do is to design programs that can be used effectively, and that we don't build rules into the program that get in the way of the goals of the program. One of the things that we've done is embodied a lot of our lessons learned on resilience into the CDBG mitigation notice. We've done a lot of that. One of the things that we're puzzling over, and why we want to talk more to other entities and local governments and NGOs, is that we can't predict when a recovery is going to be like wildly successful or when it's going to get delayed, based purely on like the factors we normally look at, like capacity to administer funds. And we're trying to figure out what all the elements are, so we can start supporting the elements that will really drive successful recovery and long-term resilience. But I think conversation is definitely the beginning place.
So I see another question here around kind of foresight into the future of the CDBG MIT program being continued for future years, if there's any perspective you have on that.
I don't know, actually, but I do know that CDBG proper and CDBG DR have always had resilience mitigation components, just not named that in the programs. But a freestanding mitigation program, I don't know. I think that down in thinking about what's the role of CDBG MIT versus what's the role of, FEMA's mitigation programs. CDBG MIT, the first appropriation for CDBG MIT was $16 billion. That was at the time bigger than the entire history of HMGP, and concentrated in fewer places. Mm-hmm. And we're all still trying to grapple with what that means and what you should do. Clearly, it should be transformational. But I think that there's definitely a conversation in the federal sphere, especially about what is the best way to get at this obvious mitigation and resilience need. Which agency, what channels. I'm actually a pretty big advocate for multiple channels, but that's a whole different discussion. America is a big, complicated country, and putting all your eggs in one basket, from what I've observed, doesn't always get you the best result, but it does raise planning problems and logistics.
Right. Alex, I'm curious, I see the question here about CDBG MIT and FEMA MIT funding and combining, or how they relate, and Jessie mentioned that a little as well. Do you have any perspective there? I know we didn't get to your brick slide quite as much, but
I don't see them combining. I would say that I agree with Jessie that there are multiple, there should be multiple avenues. What I would say is that, I think that there's lots of work for us to do to better synchronize programs across federal government, across state government. It synchronized both in eligibility and in timing, so that, as one ends, the other can pick up. And there can be some constant and some consistent streams of funding for governments and municipalities, states, so that they can count on. Many of these projects are multi-year. and require a big lead up in planning. And so you want to make sure when that planning is completed, there's some execution behind there. So there are great opportunities in synchronization of state, local, federal funds, which we should, as a community, take a look at. I would venture that certainly on the federal side, our appropriators are doing the same.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, especially when you're starting in a population, a vulnerable population that's in a deficit to begin with when a disaster hits and you haven't done the resilience work in advance necessarily. There's got to be both the response and middle recovery, and then that long-term recovery and path back to community development. And HUD, is going to be there at the beginning. We touch so many governments every year, all the time, as a daily workload, and we'll be there at the end. It's the middle that's less clear to me.
So I want to wrap the first panel with a question to Manuel here. Obviously, Jessie talked about the transformational amount of money in the MIT funding, and Puerto Rico through the various disasters is currently dealing with a potentially transformational amount of money. And you mentioned about needing to manage multiple disasters at once, but in terms of viewing it as a transformational opportunity for a jurisdiction, I'm curious if you have any lessons learned or things that you'd like to convey either to the federal partners as they think about this, or to the attendees here. And then we'll shrink our break and move kind of pretty directly to the next panel to keep the discussion going. But I wanted to give Manuel a chance.
Just piggybacking on what Jessie said about the capacity for transformation, when you have this incredible programs at your disposal after a disaster, in the case of Puerto Rico, and adding the layer of planning. I will say that the lesson learned when it comes down to mitigation is that probably, the focus of the subrecipients, is initially towards trying to address the emergency, stabilize it, of course, and then start thinking about how you're going to address the devastation, and trying to incorporate, the mitigation thinking into it, and how to face it with local and state goals associated with resiliency is probably one of the challenges that I've seen so far. So, for example, I've seen subrecipients that are way advanced in their public assistance programs. But when it comes down to the mitigation part, they're still struggling with it. Sometimes even understanding how to really benefit from this in a transformational way. When you look at eligible activities that can be funded with, in the case of Mitigation 404, there are some low-hanging fruits like generators or safe rooms. But there's a lot of things that you can do that are eligible that can really transform a community when it comes down to injecting true resiliency into the future, especially in an island when it's already a possibility into the future that we may experience, more hurricanes and even earthquakes as well. So I will say that the lesson learned is that there has to be early integration in the planning phase of the mitigation aspects of the recovery, as we are thinking how we're going to recover, the actual damages of the disaster, along with how the state has framed at the state level the policies associated with climate change, for example, renewable energy, and others that are related to resiliency.
Thanks, Manuel. We'll call that the conclusion of the first panel, because I want to make sure that we have time for our second discussion. Aisha, if you'd like to move the board, and I think we'll kind of dive right in and start the next panel with Dan and kicking things off.
Great. Good to be back with all of you. And as you've heard from all the panelists before me, I mean, disaster costs are staggering. They're going up, not down. This is only going to get worse in the future with all the emerging risks like climate change that we face in the future. So now more than ever, we need to emphasize that R word, the resilience word. And it was great to hear that again, interwoven in the previous presentations. You know that how I look at resilience is through the lens of preparedness and mitigation and insurance. And I feel just as strongly today as I did a year ago that those are really the core elements of resilience. I'd say the difference today, though, is that I realize that government alone can't fix these challenges. We need to incentivize good behavior for all of us, our governments, federal, state, local, communities, and the private sector to take the right actions. And so for preparedness, of course, the government's playing a key role in preparedness by supporting capacity building programs at the federal, state, and local level, especially those on the front lines in these state and local communities that need the support from FEMA. Hopefully they're getting it, whether it be through preparedness grants or following a disaster with public assistance. Mitigation, of course, great strides have been made recently. FEMA, thanks to that 6-to-1 number, right? $1 invested in mitigation saves $6 later. We were able to get the BRIC program funded, and BRIC has such a huge opportunity in the future. I mean, we're not just talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, but potentially billions of dollars in the future that BRIC could help support. And insurance, again, at FEMA, we were very focused on flood insurance. That's very important. However, insurance is much bigger than just flood. The challenge, that insurance gap that exists in the US is huge, and it's growing across all perils and types of insurance. So what can be done? Well, we need to incentivize good behavior. Sometimes that's incentivizing through grants like BRIC, and sometimes it's considering innovative projects like insurance, and a particular type of insurance like parametric insurance. If you haven't heard of parametric insurance, you should. The kind of bumper sticker is it's pre-specified payouts for a qualifying event. Think of a trigger like wind speed or water height, rather than going through a complicated kind of insurance adjusting process after disaster. You're deciding ahead of time, what are the perils you're worried about and how much funding would you need if that were to occur. The advantage here are twofold, at least. One, potentially lower premiums, and two, faster, more efficient payouts. You're getting paid immediately for those losses as opposed to waiting for FEMA PA. As I'm sure you'll hear the next speaker talk about the merits of FEMA public assistance, let me just say from a resilience standpoint, there are some disincentives built into the system. Think about a community wanting to invest in resilience, but knowing that they're going to qualify for, most likely qualify for FEMA public assistance should a large disaster happen. I can give you one example, Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City did the right thing. They invested in mitigation. They got parametric insurance, both for earthquake. And you know what? Last spring, an earthquake occurred. So you think, wow, this is a great case study. They have the Fix the Bricks program for mitigation. They have parametric insurance to provide some financial protection. But here's the deal. After that, after the earthquake happened, they were denied for FEMA public assistance. Why? Well, because they had some financial protection and they had some mitigation funding in place that reduced the impact. Now, ultimately, FEMA did provide some level of assistance, but the reality is we need to work together. We need these communities who are investing, who are doing the right things with mitigation and insurance, not to be penalized if a disaster occurs. Obviously, making these investments ahead of time is in all of our best interests. One area that we're looking at specifically with the thought leadership piece we put out recently, it's called community-based catastrophe insurance. That's a fancy way of saying insurance that's arranged by a local government to provide coverage to the individuals in that community. So it could be a group of citizens in that community. It could be properties that are there to make sure that, one, they have some level of protection, and two, this is where you can incentivize good behavior. You can also invest in mitigation at the same time. In other words, mitigation and insurance really shouldn't be looked at as two separate areas for resilience, but really one and the same, and you can really work together to collaborate. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Finally, let me just say, we have to have all options on the table to build resilience. And that could mean taking what were previously viewed as extreme actions, like managed retreat. That was previously viewed as a bad word, or I guess 2 words, but managed retreat, moving people and structures out of risky areas. That's something that has to be on the table. You have to have those, as difficult as it is to have those conversations, it's a lot better to have those conversations now than after disaster happens. So with that, I'll turn to Jeff.
Dan, thanks. There's one question that's come in, and then I have a follow-up if others don't come in, but how does parametric insurance help to reduce the notion of quote unquote self-insurance, which can be the equivalent of no insurance at all?
Exactly. So self-insurance would generally mean a government or potentially a business would just set aside money and say, okay, I will use this if something bad happens. Oftentimes that's not sufficient for a catastrophic disaster. Parametric is where someone else holds the risk. You know, a reinsurer would hold the risk, or some other structure outside of that government or outside of that business. And there would be agreed upon terms. Again, if X happens, you get Y payout, and you know that ahead of time going into that transaction.
So Dan, I'm curious, I think it was last year, there was a daily podcast episode about the situation in California where some of the communities at the wildland interface are becoming increasingly uninsurable due to wildfire threat. And I'm curious if, you know, for those kind of situations where individual properties may become harder to insure in the private market, are you seeing some of these community-based insurance solutions as applicable there? Is that more of a managed retreat situation? I could see that becoming relevant in more jurisdictions as we move.
Yeah, certainly very relevant there in these areas where insurance might be hard to get or where insurance is expensive. Now, when we're talking about insurance, we need traditional insurance. So you're exactly right. We have to think about either innovative insurance solutions, again, one like that community-based catastrophe insurance, where you're bringing together a community and developing a more bespoke solution, one that's directly applicable to them based on their geography, based on their risks, and their thresholds or tolerance for risk, the amount of funding they have. All of those kind of get baked into a kind of a bespoke solution. So that's one, but it's not, again, to just kind of foot stomp what I've been saying, it's not all about just insurance, right? The way that you make insurance maybe more affordable or more available is making sure you're taking actions to limit your risk. And that includes mitigation, and it could include more extreme options like managed retreat.
Dan, I'm curious, you mentioned the community-based catastrophe insurance, and then, you know, it's best coupled with limiting risk. Is there an example of where you've seen that done well to make it tangible for the audience?
Sure. So we've seen like one-offs here and there, examples of a community maybe taking a couple of steps in the right direction. But really what we decided to do is put this out more as a thought leadership piece, right? Think of it as a think piece where we say, we know this is a challenging situation in multiple jurisdictions around the country right now. Here are ways we can work together in a more collaborative way or more comprehensive way than just looking at how do I lower my insurance premiums, right? Or how do I get coverage where coverage is not currently offered? And there are options beyond just going to an insurer and saying how much for a policy.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate that. I'd like to move to Karl now as the next speaker for his opening remarks and continue our panel discussion.
Thanks for having me. So we are a local school system in Southwest Louisiana of about 32,500 students here in Calcasieu Parish. Our school system closed March 13th of 2020, like all of those in Louisiana did for COVID. We were prepared to open on August the 24th, which is 2 weeks later than our calendar that had been adopted dictated because of high infection rates in our area. We had set up staggered day schedules for our 7th through 12th graders. 80,000 masks and 4,500 thermometers and plexiglass for our teachers. We had sectioned off large areas for our groups of 25 with fire retardant visqueen that we actually had to go to California to get because it's not too easy to come by. Obviously, we didn't make that. We never opened because Hurricane Laura hit us on August 27th. At our airport here in Lake Charles, Louisiana, they measured 154 mile per hour sustained winds with gusts of 196 miles per hour. In our system, we had 74 of our 76 campuses that were damaged. We also had a lot of infrastructure damage here in the city and in our parish. We have parishes in Louisiana rather than counties. We also had no internet for about 60 days throughout, which, considering the COVID situation, made virtual instruction impossible. I had a young man that I was visiting with from Iowa. He was here with his uncle on a debris truck about 2 weeks after this Laura hit. And I was standing in my front yard and I asked him, I said, hey man, what do you think of this? He said, well, I called my buddy and I told him, he said, you know how we have a tornado that hits a subdivision and goes up one side of the street? He said, and tears up everything. He said, down here, it was one of those, but it was 50 miles wide. And so that's sort of what we experienced here. So as we were preparing, getting dried out, had actually started 18 schools back in session. On October 9th, we got hit by Hurricane Delta in the exact same pathway. While Delta was only, and I say only, 110 mile per hour winds, when you have a million square feet of temporary roof on your schools, it does a lot of damage when it's 110 miles an hour. So I'd really quickly like to talk about several challenges we faced. So as a local school system, we're in pretty good financial shape. We had $50 million in reserves, which, like I said, is pretty good for just a local government. We have already blown through that significantly, and we're bleeding cash right now. I'm having to talk my chief financial officer off the ledge daily here. We've applied for and received a $100 million line of credit. We've already drawn 75 million of that. Our remediation and dry-in came in at about $130 million. We have 14 architects that we've procured through our process. They're drawing 25% design fee on over $200 million of damage and repairs. So I guess that first challenge is a way for the locals to get cash quickly. And you guys are very knowledgeable, as I've heard on this call, but that is something as a local governmental subdivision that's important to us. The second challenge is, while nearly every road in our jurisdiction was unpassable with trees and debris and tin and so forth, I think the figurative roadway standing in our way that's blocked is blocked with red tape. And I know we've gotten better with everything over the years, but we still saw procurement challenges and are still seeing them. Confusion for a novice on the application process, just where to go, what to do, and so forth. State and local declarations and when they're made and who makes them and what it allows us to do. And then in our case, everybody wants to use our school buildings because they're perceived to be tanks during an emergency. And our roofs were just destroyed and they were leaking and they still wanted to use them. The National Guard, law enforcement, all of these, United Way, Red Cross, and that just becomes very burdensome when you're just trying to get open and to clean up your stuff. So thirdly, we manage a lot of grants as a school system, and we have a lot of grant interfaces. It seems like the disaster portal is a little bit different in that it's not driven by the policy, but instead the portal drives the policy in some cases. When you're trying to enter things, even in dialogue boxes, if the wrong word goes there, it kicks you out completely. So it makes it very difficult through the portal and the process to get where you need to be sometimes. And we've experienced that in other cases with software, where the policy really doesn't drive the software, but the other way around. That's especially hard when you're feeling kind of beat up and having that extra challenge. Lastly, we've learned that we need to have friends ahead of time, and we learn it the hard way. You get complacent when you don't have a disaster for a little while. We need to have those relationships in place. And you guys, I'm sure all know that because that's what you do for a living, but prior to the disaster. So with remediation companies, with environmental engineers, grant consultants and project managers, even contractors. We're already starting to run short of contractors here in this part of Louisiana and in our state. So we're having to to do all of these things under duress just because we did get complacent. And that's partially our fault too. And so we've learned the hard way that, you know, we really don't know if we'll get another one next year. We're starting now to make those relationships known, and hopefully they'll carry into next year if we have another one. So our community here has had 4 declared disasters in 12 months with COVID, Hurricane Laura, Hurricane Delta, and the ice storm. And by the way, temporary roofs don't do very well in ice. So as they melt, the leaks have all started again, and we're going to have to put new temporary measures in place before we can fix those roofs permanently. The last thing I will say is that in school systems, especially even more so than police juries and cities, there's the immediate pressure from parents and students to get back into school, especially with COVID when they hadn't been there in 8 months. As the schools go, the community goes. And I think we feel that pressure even more so when these disasters hit is we just have to get them back in. And so our consultants are all telling us we're impatient. And I have to admit, I am very impatient. I just want to get it done and I want to move forward, and it just doesn't move that fast. And so we're struggling to acknowledge that and realize it. But we feel pretty good with our current situation, and we're on the road to recovery. So thanks for letting me be a part of this, and I'll answer any questions you have.
So Karl, you went in a little bit of a different direction than I thought you were going to with the My Friends before and after disaster. Sorry, fighter jet going by. With the My Friends before and after disaster comment. So it sounded like you were talking almost about having master services agreements in place or standing contracts with certain types of companies that may be valuable in a disaster response situation. I thought you might have been heading in the direction of relationships with other school districts, or leveraging their contracting vehicles or MSAs if your local capacity is stretched, or something akin to the utility mutual aid agreements that often kick into place. And I was curious if there was anything along those lines that you had explored or
what we do have here is we work very well. We have a group, an executive group that includes our sheriff, our police jury, and every city in our local jurisdiction. And for every potential disaster, even the ones that don't reach us, we meet multiple times before and during these storms, in our case, usually hurricanes, work very well together. So we have those relationships in place. You're right. I am talking about those relationships with the people you need to help make you back whole. And we were hitting it by Rita in 2005. And so that's a long time back for us. And like I said, we just get too relaxed, and we let, even though we had some of those things in place, you tend to let them, expire and they aren't up to date, and your price listing may be 3 or 4 years old. And then, man, when this happens, you're under such pressure and duress to get it done. That's not the time when you want to be negotiating those things.
That makes sense. Karl, there's another question that came in around how the FEMA obligations have been going for you.
So we do have a consultant in place, and really the remediation and the dry end is where we hope to get our first cash back. The companies are slow invoicing us. We had one big burst, and now it's coming in slowly. It's just tough to get those invoices in a situation where FEMA, there'll be a few questions, I guess. We're trying to get them right from the beginning so that we don't have to debate these things for a year to be able to get our money back. And so we're taking our time a little bit, which is causing a little of that cash crunch. But I think once we submit, it should move through the pipeline pretty quickly.
Great. Karl, I really appreciate that. Let's go ahead, Jeff. Why don't you move into your remarks, and then we'll see, we may have a couple minutes for wrap up questions or discussions across what we heard today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here today, Karl. It's very telling. I was in Southwest Louisiana and rode Hurricane Laura out in Iowa, Louisiana, not to be confused with Iowa, but so definitely know that the destruction, the amount of destruction that was in Southwest Louisiana was amazing. And Karl mentioned 4 disasters that have been declared for his area, for Southwest Louisiana and Calcasieu Parish. You add that to the 953 other open disasters that FEMA's working, it can give you a little bit of scale of just the magnitude of the open disasters. So, I'm going to take a little bit different kind of turn here for this group to really just put some thought out there. Let me say this: recovery is the toughest job in emergency management. Everybody wants it faster. Everybody wants it right. Everybody wants it more. It is extremely challenging, when you talk about emergency management. I can tell you firsthand, the folks at FEMA are just top notch. That's what they do. They think about it. They spend a lot of time trying to get to yes and weave different regulations and rules, and then try to seam different programs together with CDBG, DR, I probably butchered that one, all the other appropriations that come down. So, I asked this question: how do we look at recovery a little different? One of the things that I think needs to be explored, and it would be a legislative change, is, give FEMA the authority to mission assign federal agencies to do recovery. And what I mean by that is put like terms together. If housing is in the name of your agency, well, maybe you should take on the housing mission, with funding out of the DRF. If roads are in your agency, maybe we look at how do we engage Federal Highways, who has great relationships with the states, to manage the recovery of the roads, utilizing existing systems. You have it's all the same money, but it comes through different agencies, which means different regulations, different grant portals, different grant systems. And a lot of times from the emergency management standpoint, especially at the state level, you're the agency that gets tasked to manage this. So it can be very difficult. I know states right now that emergency management, agencies are tasked with managing the appropriations through HUD and other agencies that they're just not accustomed to do. So how do you combine those like terms and get states involved as well? Other state agencies, like those entities that manage HUD grants on a daily basis, plus those entities up that already know those regulations and that can help manage that. So my point on that is, we've got to look at emergency management as a whole, but specifically recovery, as more than one agency. You all heard the amount of money that's out there. It's tremendous. And I think there's probably, and the numbers may have changed, but there's multiple billions of dollars that have been out there on the mitigation side that have yet been unspent. So, I don't see money as being necessarily the amount of money being the problem. Is how do we get it to those that need it, and how do we make the best use for it? Those of you that know me know I'm gonna touch on and talk about community lifelines. I won't go through that presentation, but I can tell you this from the emergency management standpoint. We should look at legislative measures, legislative fixes that can focus those dollars into the community lifelines. If we can keep the power and the water on, that's 90% of the problems in most disasters. I go back to Manuel in Puerto Rico, which I know all too well. The first 5 or 6 months, our focus at FEMA, as the focus of all the first responders and those engaged, was really getting that temporary power up and running, and then getting the water up and running. You couldn't think about recovery from other aspects if the power and water isn't on. Same with Calcasieu Parish. Early on, and I say early on, it was an extended time. Even when the power came back on, there was not potable water. The water was not up and running. So, you've got to focus on those things. So I know time is short, but I think you got to look at the legislative change. Remember this: all this is guided by laws, and those that are tasked to implement those laws are doing it to the best of their ability. So, real change comes through legislative action, and, the ability to step back and think about how we do recovery and how do we get other federal agencies engaged. and then allow those federal agencies to use their existing systems, their existing contracting. I mean, you think about buildings. You know, the Corps of Engineers has a just wealth of knowledge in contracting. They have a wealth of knowledge in construction standards and how that goes. You know, you're asking that to go through folks that may not have the expertise to write the right specs and the right bids, which then, you know, creates, you know, multiple versions of project worksheets and so forth. So, you know, I think we got to look at recovery as we move forward. The data shows it's not going to stop. Disasters are not going to slow down. So how do we get more people involved? How do we spread the joy and spread the fun to other partners, not just in the response phase, but more importantly in the recovery phase, which goes on for years. We're still obligating funds for Hurricane Katrina that happened in 2005. You know, how do we look at one you know, avenue that also I would suggest that really states and locals need to take more advantage of is Section 428 of the Public Assistance Program, which allows for you know, a lot more flexibility on how those dollars can be used based on the disaster damage scopes and so forth. So, you know, it's really about partnerships and relationships, but more importantly, let's utilize the existing systems we have, but we have to have some legislative changes to allow more mission assignment directives as we do in response. In recovery, and let those agencies that have that traditional relationship work together. And again, I go back to keep the power and water on, and that's 90% of our problems when it comes to disasters. And I'm all for every bit of mitigation. I think every dollar you put on the front end saves lives and it saves property, and we should really keep enforcing that, and then figure out a way to get the money spent, because we shouldn't have billions of dollars sitting, you know, obligated, but not going into the ground, not going into projects that can save those lives in future disasters. So that was a lot and a little, and I'll be happy to take any questions or shift them to Dan Kaniewski if they're really hard questions.
So Jeff, I see a second question on the board around the engagement of corporate partners in optimizing disaster release efforts and what results that could yield. I wonder if you could riff on your thoughts on that.
Of course, yes. You know, one of the up and coming emergency support functions is really related to bringing in the private sector. And let me say this, you know, whole community has been around for a long time. It is a great concept, 100% behind that concept, but let's really do that. You know, the private sector has a wealth of capabilities that are not brought to bear. We did see that. We've seen progress in that with the COVID response, which is very, very positive. But, you know, when you think about you get out of response where there's certain things in response that are inherently a government function. But, you know, when you think about logistics, when you think about how do you do cost analyzation, how do you do rapid assessments utilizing technology, the insurance, you know, industry does that now. How do we take that and put that into the individual assistance program and look at different ways, maybe not count doorknobs, but, you know, different categories of damage, and that money gets into the hands of the disaster survivors very, very quickly. So, you know, I think that not allowing the private sector, let me back that up. I didn't mean not allowing, but not fully, you know, bringing the private sector into under the tent of emergency management and what we do is going to be a mistake. And let me say this, you cannot expect the private sector to learn ICS and all the different terminologies. We have to adapt that language into simple form so that the private sector understands what emergency managers are talking about and what the needs may be. And then you turn them loose and let them do what they do on a daily basis, which is deliver goods and services. And they, you know, create and innovate different ways of looking at difficult problems, and they should be at the table just as the government partners are as well.
So there is a question about what do you think is holding up the spending of the money?
Oh, we got another couple hours.
Briefly.
Now, I think Karl hit it on the head, you know, and it's not a negative. You know, this may come across, it is what it is. It's you know, mitigation takes you got benefit cost analysis. You've got different environmental, which is all important that has to be looked at. And then you got the match, states and local governments, it's difficult to match 25% on a lot of mitigation. So there's many factors that are at play and many variables that go into, why some of the dollars aren't spent. So, the question is, okay, how do we start removing barriers and producing enablers to get this money to viable projects that protect our infrastructure?
There's another more extended question here around, are you suggesting that FEMA focuses on response, IA and infrastructure recovery, and HUD focuses on housing recovery and talks a little bit about at the local level rules for HUD buyout and maybe different than FEMA buyout, which can cause grant shopping and confusion, and needing state and federal government and resources to support different programs. But there's 2 to 3 people at the local level. So I guess basically riffing a little bit more on what are you suggesting in terms of this focus?
So, if you look at FEMA, FEMA is there to support state and local governments in response, and then, provide funding for the recovery efforts. FEMA's really, the creation of FEMA was focused on those catastrophic disasters, those, 1 to 5% disasters. But the business model of FEMA right now is all recovery. So it's really hard to, and then FEMA is what, 20 to 21,000 folks, I think, FEMA wide, which is not all in recovery. So, when you have agencies that deal with housing issues, and HUD does a tremendous job and just a wonderful job in how they do that. But when it comes to disaster recovery, the timelines aren't there. So you've got local governments and state governments when we're dealing with CDBDR, and I butcher that every time, I shouldn't, but they may be holding out on certain programs, waiting on this appropriation, because if they take this program for housing, they may not be eligible for certain other appropriations. If it's dealing with housing, how do we streamline first, but then, put those federal dollars that again are coming from all the same place, right? These are, this is all taxpayer dollars coming from, appropriations, either in the DRF or separate appropriations, through congressional action. And let housing be in one bucket, let infrastructure be in one bucket, let federal highways be in one bucket that deal with state DOTs and local DOTs. Now I know that, look, that I don't want to look at this, through rose-colored glasses. I know that, everything I just said takes one, legislative change, it takes, regulation change, and it takes, an openness and willingness to work together and produce, positive outcomes.
Karl, I'm curious if you have any in reaction to this from the local level, or Dan, even from the mission signing of agency perspective.
Yeah, I think my whole point about getting to cash, ultimately, we're going to get reimbursed at whatever level is authorized. And we feel confident about that going in, but it just takes so long to get your hands on the cash that we just kind of struggle in the meantime. So I would agree with what Jeff's saying. The cash is out there. It's allocated pretty early. Just how do we get to it? In a manner that doesn't put us through so much pain, I guess. Just while we're waiting for it.
Dan, any additional thoughts on the concept of mission assigning for the recovery phase opposed to response phase?
Well, of course, my goal and all of our goals should be to put FEMA recovery out of business, that we invest so much in mitigation, again, not just federally, but invest in mitigation as a society, that the disaster losses to the taxpayer and the need for the FEMA PA program goes down over time. And of course, I'm saying that half in jest, but really, I mean, that should be our goal. My goal at FEMA was always to put Jeff out of business. And he was like, that'd be great. That's a perfect end state. But the reality is we're not going to get there anytime soon, right? So we do need the federal bureaucracies to work together to do this effectively, to support those communities in need after they are hit by a disaster, particularly, as Jeff said, a catastrophic disaster. That's really where FEMA plays a big role and needs to be there to help those state and local communities when they're overwhelmed or incapacitated.
So it looks like we have one final question before we wrap here, which is, is there a way to encourage partnerships and multi-agency response that doesn't result in projects aligned by silos of housing, transit, et cetera? And whether Jeff wants to take that, or Dan or others, kind of open that up as the last one.
Now, I hate to be the one to say, can you repeat the question? Or if
Sure.
it's in the chat, I'll try to read. Yeah.
Is there a way to encourage partnerships and multi-agency response that doesn't result in projects aligned by silos of housing, transit, et cetera? Kind of I think Jeff was talking about bucketing all of the transportation, bucketing, different types of projects, and this one seems to be getting at partnerships and multi-agencies without the silo of housing or transit. Is there an alternative option?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer that the best I can and let Dan close with it. The key to, in emergency management, and the people on this call know this all too well, you can have systems and processes and everything. If you don't build relationships and partnerships, you've already lost. That is the key 24/7, 365 in emergency management, is knowing, who you can call and who can call you. So, I think at the state level, that focus has always been, generally coming out of the governor's office, and you really have good synergy, when it comes to state emergency management agencies. But, I guess bucketing projects, I'd have to get a little bit more deeper in that. And I apologize. And I don't know who asked that question, but happy to, talk to you offline or get a little bit more in that. I don't want to answer that because I don't guess I fully understand the question, and that's on me, not the person asking the question.
So I think we're running up against time here. So I think it's probably a good time to close and to thank our panelists for joining today, and for all of you that joined via the webinar and engaged in the discussion. If there's any, Marko or folks from NEMA, if there's any other wrap up comments, this would be the time.
One, I want to thank everybody for participating, and all of those that put in questions into the chat box and sent in questions. We appreciate that greatly. And I want to thank NEMA for hosting and setting up this series and allowing us to be part of it. And thank the panelists for all of their help and all of their assistance. I know we tried a new technology here. I think actually it was rather interesting to watch it unfold, and the interaction with all of you. Your points were excellent. We've learned a lot on how to engage an audience a little bit differently, and I think there's some great lessons to be learned moving forward. And at the same time, a lot of great dialogue, which really does need to continue across all of our communities and all of our governmental structures. So with that, on behalf of ICF, I want to thank everybody for being with us and thank NEMA for hosting.